Welcome to this Talks at Google virtual event. My name is Jenny Hamer, and I'm a machine learning researcher at Google AI. A friendly reminder to the audience that we'll be taking questions towards the end of this talk. Should you have questions that come up during today's presentation and conversation, please be sure to add them to the live chat on the right-hand side of the interface. I'm very excited to introduce today's guest, Dr. Temple Grandin, who will be speaking about her new book, Visual Thinking: The Hidden Gifts of People Who Think in Pictures, Patterns, and Abstractions. Dr. Grandin is a professor of animal sciences at Colorado State University, where her unique perspective as an autistic scientist and innovator has led to substantial improvements in the welfare and humane treatment of livestock animals. Dr. Grandin has shared intimate aspects of her experience growing up as an autistic child during the 1950s, which has garnered national attention through her best-selling books, including The Autistic Brain and Thinking in Pictures. Thinking in Pictures was transformed into the eponymous HBO film, which portrayed her challenges and successes breaking into the male-dominated field of animal agriculture in the 1970s. Her early autism advocacy has helped increase the visibility, awareness, and acceptance of autism in the mainstream. It's an honor to warmly welcome Dr. Temple Grandin for her fourth Talks at Google event.
Hi, I'm Temple Grandin, and it's great to be here today on the StreamYard. And that's my title slide, my new book, Visual Thinking. And when I first started out, I didn't even know that other people thought differently than I did. We can go to the next slide. I was shocked when I first learned that other people didn't think in pictures. When I started my early work, I thought everybody thought in pictures. I didn't know that people thought differently. And then I discovered when I was in my late 30s, when I asked a speech therapist to think about a church steeple, she just got this vague representation like this instead of the vivid pictures I get, where I think of specific places. No, that was a shock. First inkling that other people didn't think the same way I did. We'll go to the next slide, which shows a shadow that can scare cattle. And my very first work, I got down into the chutes to see what cattle were seeing. Now, that's a shadow of me with an iPhone. That was taken much more recently. But that's an example of the kind of thing that the cattle would be afraid of. And then an equipment startup this spring, there was a big wagon wheel shadow that appeared, I called a spider monster. It was not there in the morning, but it was there in the afternoon. But nobody before had thought about what are the animals actually looking at. Well, I guess if you think in words, you'd be less likely to look at what cattle are looking at. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the thing in engineering, there's different ways that you can figure out risk. You can calculate risk, or you can see risk. Now, fortunately, this launch pad had a rocket on it that's already had a successful mission. That is good. But I'm a total NASA geek. And if I'd been better at math, I would have gone into aerospace, but I'm absolutely hopeless in algebra. But I was underneath that launch pad 5 years ago. And I saw something in there that should not be in there. And I saw equipment that they were working on inside that base that I don't want a raccoon who's on the next slide to be near. And nobody else saw the raccoon. There's a picture of him on the next slide. And I'm visualizing all the stuff he could have been chewing, electrical panels, all kinds of things I wouldn't want him around. Nobody else saw him. Well, I'm sure they got rid of him. That was 5 years ago. But nobody else knew that a raccoon was living in the base of that launch pad. We'll go on to the next slide. Now, you need visual thinkers like me who think in photorealistic pictures to help make research much more reproducible. There's been a big problem in biomedical research on experiments not being reproducible. And there was a major mess with the millions of dollars worth of cancer research where the results came out differently because one lab used that little magnetic stirrer and the other used a cute little Ferris wheel thing to mix up their samples. And it totally changed the results. It matters which mixing device you use. And I review a lot of scientific papers. I'm going to leave the math to somebody else, but I'll tear apart the method section. And in paper after paper, I find out they didn't tell me how they housed their pigs. They didn't tell me what they fed their animals. The most basic things that can completely change the results, they're not telling me. And that's papers I'm looking at right now. Let's go to the next slide. There's three basic different ways of thinking. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, the first is me. I'm an object visualizer. I found out that there's actually a name for my kind of thinking. And I think in photorealistic pictures. And the kind of careers I'd be good at is inventing mechanical equipment, art, photography, working with animals, highly skilled trades, art and mechanics. They go together. That sounds weird. Art and mechanics go together. And the people that I worked with on all kinds of clever engineered equipment, none of them could do algebra. You see, it's too abstract. Some people think you have to have algebra in order to think logically. I was just reading this morning in the brand new Science about this, about a game, a new game that artificial intelligence has figured out. And it's a game that's so much in patterns, I don't understand it. Now, one of the things that's given me a good life is having an interesting career, because I was bullied horribly in high school. I was called all kinds of names, and the only places I was not bullied was friends through shared interests. And a good career is one place where you can get friends who shared interests. And in high school, it was model rockets, electronic circuit boards, and riding horses. That's where I had friends. And I had one lady who was autistic tell me when she got a job with a tech company that she was with her people now. So that was an example of a career that might make you have a better life and have better mental health. We'll go on to the next slide. Okay, now here's your mathematicians, the spatial visualizer. There's two kinds of visualizers. There's the object visualizer like me, who thinks in photorealistic pictures, very bottom-up thinking. And there's a spatial visualizer who thinks in patterns. These are going to be your programmers. They're your computer programmers, your engineers, your chemists. Music and math, those two things tend to go together. All of your data analytics. Now, where you might need a visual thinker like me is on the training sets given to artificial intelligence. I got fascinated when I read a number of, not that long ago, about a program that could diagnose melanoma. And it was trained with several thousand pictures of melanoma and other things. That's bottom-up thinking. That's exactly how I think. I put specific examples into categories. We'll go on to the next slide. And then here's the verbal thinker. Writers, sales, marketing, psychologist, lawyer, teacher, very top-down in their thinking, big, broad concepts. And we'll go on to the next slide. Now, there's research that shows that the different kinds of thinking exist. And I have an entire chapter in my book, Visual Thinking, that shows evidence that the different thinking actually does exist. And some of that was reviewed earlier in my book, The Autistic Brain, but I've added many, many more studies to the visual thinking book. And where the object visualizer and the mathematical mind, they're actually opposite skills. They're like two types of visualization, but they're opposite skills. See, games like chess, that's a pattern. I was never any good at chess. Let's go to the next slide. Now, a lot of people are mixtures of the different kinds of thinking. There can be mixtures. And we'll go to the next slide. Turns out that I've got a huge internet trunk line in my head, huge a visual thinking circuit. Let's go to the next slide. We'll show another picture of my visual thinking circuit. And we can go on to the next slide. Now, here's some interesting new research. How do you prefer to get information? You want to look at the pictures? Okay, let's say I want to teach you how a water pump works. Well, I'm going to look at the pictures of how the pump works, the diagrams. The verbal thinker will read the text. The mathematician will actually look at both. But I definitely look at the pictures first. And when I read papers, I look at all the graphs and the tables first. And actually, there's an article about, I did an interview article, the New York Times, and I don't like graphic novels because that requires too much switching back and forth between the pictures and the text. I'll spend a long time looking at the graphs, then I read the text. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is an interesting study on how projects are done. These were high school students at 3 different specialized schools, art students, science students, and humanities students that were verbal thinkers. And the project was to take teams of students and have them invent a planet. And the art students made fantastic, crystal planets, skyscraper planets, planets with polar bears on them. The science students would just draw a round circle, give you the facts about the atmosphere and the gravity. And the humanities students started with words, and then they figured that was against the rules. So then they did colored splotches. But the thing that really disturbed me about the verbal thinkers is they did no planning of their planets. Verbal thinking tends to be very top down, very, very conceptual. Okay, with something like maybe an inclusive environment, for example. But how do you actually achieve this? My mind would think in specific examples. Here's a situation where an inclusive environment worked. And here's another situation where there's a big, huge problem. And one of the big problems I run into all the time is where a person has autism, dyslexia, or some other thing, doing just fine with the boss. Then they get a new boss. I almost lost a job over that until I showed that new boss a portfolio of articles I've written. But that's oftentimes a problem. There was a sad case where a guy got fired from a fencing company because a new boss just blabbed out the instructions. Well, I don't remember long sequential instructions, and he built the fence wrong and got fired. But that's a problem area that comes up all the time, is where a person can be very successful, and then there's a new boss and there's problems. Let's go to the next slide. Verbal thinkers overgeneralize and leave out the details. Yeah, don't put a salesman in charge of building a big factory. He won't listen to any of his tech people, and then they build a factory that didn't have enough wastewater treatment, and the town closed it. Yeah, giant mess, multi-million-dollar mess, big ego too, wouldn't listen. Then the object visualizers and the math, we're more bottom-up thinkers. Specific examples of things that work, specific examples of things that may not work, and oftentimes too many details. Verbal thinkers don't have enough details. Let's go to the next slide. Let's look at the early inventors. The early inventors, it was all mechanical equipment. And when I was in fourth grade and I was elementary school, my favorite book was about famous inventors. You know, Elias Howe and the sewing machine, grain harvesting equipment, the cotton gin. And when the patent office first started, all the inventions were mechanical. And you had to give the patent office models. They finally stopped that. But it was mechanical. This would have been your object visualizers. These are mechanical devices. Let's go to the next slide. And first 3D printer, this is the inventor. You got to remember, a 3D printer is a mechanical device controlled by a computer. So an example of complementary minds, let's say in robotics, for example, is somebody like me would make the tool that goes on the ends of the robot's arm, and then the visual spatial mathematicians will program the computer. I've seen this over and over again with equipment. Let's go to the next slide. Now, we don't make it anymore. In 2019, right before COVID shut everything down and turned all my travel off for a year, I went to a state-of-the-art poultry plant, a state-of-the-art 2 pork plants, and the Steve Jobs Theater, and we're not making this stuff. You've got equipment now coming in from Holland. Now, I like to call this part of engineering where it's very cleverly designed mechanical things. I call it the clever engineering department. And this is where the problem is. We're losing our clever engineers. And they're the ones that can't do math. People I work with, they can't do algebra. Half of all large industrial printers, 3D printers, come from Europe. We'll go to the next slide. The state-of-the-art electronic chip making machine is from Holland, even though the US invented the basic technology. That's the inside of it. The next slide will show the outside of it, and you can see all the mechanical devices here. And then when I got on the website of ASML, there was a repairman there with little tiny screwdrivers fixing things. Well, we've paid a price for taking out the shop classes. We paid a big price. Let's go to the next slide. And the state-of-the-art electron microscope. And I just saw a great big advertisement this morning in my issue of Science for more goodies that this thing has for even better visualization. We'll go to the next slide. Okay, this is pork plant that I saw in 2019, and everything you see there is imported mostly from Holland and a little bit from Quebec, Canada. And I'm going, we're not making this stuff, and it's not just food processing plant stuff. Let's go to the next slide. The Mars parachute. High-tech looms from Europe wove the fabric. We made the parachute here, but we did not make the fabric for the Mars lander parachute. Let's go to the next slide. And the structural glass walls and the roof of the Steve Jobs Theater and the structural glass of the Apple mothership building. It's from Italy and Germany, and the roof is from Dubai. Now, this goes back to decisions we've made in education that I don't think were very good decisions. Let's go to the next slide. I get asked all the time, if I could change something in the schools, what would I change? I'd put all these hands-on classes back in. I loved art, sewing, and cooking. When I was in 4th grade, I had a Singer Sew Handy. It was a toy sewing machine that actually sewed. It was one of my favorite things. I made costumes for the school play on it. Playing musical instruments. I had a little flute. I never could figure out how to play it, but at least I was exposed. Woodworking, welding. We've got kids growing up today totally separated from the world of the practical. No, it's a problem. You're going to be making decisions about, real things. No, it's a big problem. And you need visual thinkers like me to prevent disasters like Fukushima. The mathematicians did a great job of making it shake-proof and earthquake-proof. Everything was fine. 20 minutes later, the tsunami breached the seawall, flooded the site, and what do you think happened to the electric emergency cooling pump? It drowned. Nobody thought to put watertight doors on it. That's seeing risk, not calculating risk. You better believe it. Every reactor in Japan now has watertight doors. Yeah, I've looked up their websites. But this is where you need a visual thinker like me to say, hey, you better put some watertight doors on this thing. Now, this goes back to the educational system. In Italy and Germany and Denmark and Holland, you can go in by 9th grade tech route or university route, and they don't stick their nose up at the tech route. We've had the tendency to go, well, those stupid kids take shop. Well, let me tell you, I worked with a lot of people that barely graduated my school. They were not stupid, and they were building big, complicated factories. But it's a different kind of intelligence. I was out on these construction projects for long periods of time. I saw it. Let's go to the next slide. Our educational system is screening out the object visualizers. I'm seeing kids kept out of auto mechanics class because they can't do algebra. Yeah, for linear algebra, that is needed for artificial intelligence. I can find the papers on MIT. I can find the paper. I don't understand them, but I could give that paper to some kid that could just, take off on it. One of the big problems I'm seeing with parents is they get so hung up on the autism label, they can't imagine that kid even is capable of doing anything, and they're not even learning shopping. Let's go to the next slide. My grandfather was a co-inventor of the autopilot for airplanes, and he was an MIT-trained mathematical engineer, typical engineer. He worked with another guy who was probably autistic, who came up with this radical little idea, 3 little coils for the autopilot. Everybody in aviation thought it was stupid. It was totally simple. Everybody in avionics was trying to wire the plane's controls directly to the magnetic compass. What do you think happened? It was, you know how much compass wiggles. Disaster. Well, they tinkered in an old loft, and they got this thing to work. It was in every plane during World War II. But the problem is the stolen version was in every plane during World War II. This is where they needed a lawyer. They'd had a lawyer, it would not have gotten ripped off. And my grandfather did not sue because we needed it for the war effort, so he didn't sue. Fortunately, at the end of the war, he did get a decent settlement with another company that was making it. Let's go to the next slide. But that's an example of minds working together. Now let's go back to the food processing plants. I went back through every client I have worked with. I have been out on construction sites for almost every major company. And what I found is the object visualizers, and they got 2 jobs, drafting technician or welder. You might have a person who had 1 semester class in CAD drafting, and this person's laying out entire factories. And how did he get that job? He showed a homework assignment of a water valve to the right person. And then you had welders that were inventing and patenting equipment, often not getting credit for it. Just don't get me started on that. But inventing and patenting totally new mechanical devices. But the thing that was interesting, when I went back to all the jobs, my kind of mind never messed with refrigeration or boilers. That's stuff that's too mathematical. So you had the degreed engineer doing boilers, refrigeration, make sure the roof doesn't collapse, water and power requirements. And I saw this division of labor in every plant. But what's happening now is we have a huge shortage of people to fix things. I've been on some rather questionable elevators just very recently, scraping in the shaft, doors not working right, skipping floors. Yeah, they're not getting serviced. The next time you see somebody fixing an elevator or an escalator, check out how much gray hair there is. There's a bunch of them that I got a lot of gray hair, and they're not getting replaced because the kid who ought to be fixing that elevator or maybe fixing mechanical stuff in one of your server farms is playing video games in the basement. I'll tell you how to get them off the video games. Show them that mechanical devices are interesting. That'll get them off the video games. I wish these kids were getting fantastic jobs in that industry, but that's not what's happening. Let's go to the next slide. So on the book, Visual Thinking, I wrote the initial drafts, and I'm kind of associational, kind of disorganized in my thinking. And Betsy Lerner, my very verbal co-author, reorganized my thoughts. And so we worked together, knowing how we have different kinds of skills. But I learned something that really worries me even more about taking the hands-on classes. If you have a completely verbal people, and these are the people that go into politics and policy, making policy about real stuff out in the world, like waterworks or something like that, if they haven't had real experiences with actual real things like tools, they don't understand them. I was trying to explain Betsy leverage using little kids' websites, and she only understood it when I said, "Hey, Betsy, have you ever pried the lid off a paint can?" And then I explained the leverage. Then she understood it. But she could only had to relate back to something she'd actually had done. Let's go to the next slide. Now let's look in building buildings. The engineers will make for safe, structural loads. Everything's going to be safe, but maybe you're going to have a boring concrete box. And the architects, they're going to have creativity, appearance. You see, you need both kinds of minds to make buildings that are both attractive and totally functional. Let's go to the next slide. 20% of the people I worked with on equipment were either autistic, dyslexic, or ADHD, all undiagnosed. And how did they get into their field? Grew up working on cars or took a single welding class in high school. And some of these people owned big shops, multiple patents, and most of them absolutely couldn't do algebra. And there's one of them. He took a single welding class, and he now has a corporate jet and builds all kinds of big stuff. But I'm concerned some of those people are aging out too. And I just recently we needed to get somebody to fix some of my equipment. The one shop that's left is gouging like 5-10 times the price right now. That's serious. Let's go to the next slide. Now, grandparents come up to me all the time, and they discover they're autistic when the kids get diagnosed. And they've had good jobs because they've learned how to work when they were young kids. Now, where a diagnosis can help an older person is in relationships. Then they understand why there's problems with their wife or problems with coworkers at work. I'm seeing on the work front, there's too many people that you need to work at Google that aren't getting exposed to enough stuff, so they end up getting into these really good jobs. And some people have said I'm just, I put too much emphasis on career. Career is what's given me meaning in life. I've had friends in animal behavior. Some of the best times I've ever had is sitting around the job trailer and talking about how to build stuff. And back in the days when I did not understand the differences between visual thinking and verbal thinking, we used to talk about stupid suits. Well, I didn't realize that they think about things differently. And you sometimes need a verbal thinker to organize things, because some of these metalworking shops I worked with, the wife ran the business part of the shop. Let's go to the next slide. What would happen to some of today's great innovators, some of yesterday's great innovators, if they went into today's educational system? I'm concerned. The next slide shows Michelangelo, and he was dropped out of school at age 12. He was kind of grubby and dirty and naughty, but he was running around in all the churches and seeing great art. That's exposure. And he grew up with stone cutting tools. Then he was mentored. So there's a lot of individuals where you got to get exposed to things to get interested in. Then you get mentored. That's a pattern that happens all the time. And we got to find a lot more back doors into jobs. I've seen people get a job on the factory floor, migrate to maintenance. 15 years later, they are building the new plant addition. I've seen that. And they may be a high school graduate. Let's go to the next slide. Steve Jobs, bullied in school. Now, Steve Jobs was an artist. He wasn't a programmer. That's why iPhones are easy to use. Then the mathematicians had to program it. That's an example of different minds working together. He worked on the interface and the user experience. And in visual thinking, I talk about the two Steves developing the early computers. Wozniak wanted to put 5 expansion slots on a computer. And Steve Jobs is going, no, make it simple. Well, and that helped make everybody have computers. Einstein would end up in an autism program today because he had no speech until age 3. Let's go to the next slide. Thomas Edison, another high school dropout, learned how to work. And then he had a mentor that taught him how to use the telegraph. That helped him get into his final career. But he learned working skills. Let's go to the next slide. Elon Musk is on the spectrum, a great engineer, fabulous engineer. And we're just going to have to wait and see what happens with Twitter. And we'll go on to the next slide. A Nobel Prize winner was 50% more likely to have an arts and crafts hobby compared to other scientists. That's another reason why we shouldn't be taking these things out of the schools. And a lot of people that work with mathematical things go into music. They're very much because music is patterns. Let's go to the next slide. Let's look at some tips for working with minds that are different. Do not overload working memory. If the boss comes up to me and goes, blah, 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 I can't remember the sequence of what he wants. So give me a pilot's checklist so that step 1, step 2, step 3, very, very simple little accommodation. And I talked about the guy who worked for the fencing company, and the new boss didn't let him do that. And he got fired for building stuff wrong. Vague instructions do not work. Don't just say develop some new software. Okay, you want some software, some very specific thing. I understand, Jenny, that you are in machine learning. You probably work better if there's some specific thing they want you to do in that. When I work on team projects, I like to have a specific part of the project that's mine. And I did that with the mechanical things I worked on. Like my responsibility stopped at a certain rail switch, for example, on the line. Clear, but what am I supposed to be doing? And the other thing I learned, don't rub your colleagues' noses in their mistakes. I have a concept, I call it project loyalty. I see you smiling there. Project loyalty, that's why I wanted to have you on the screen, because I like to talk to somebody. I don't like talking to dead computers. That's something I just hate. But I have worked on things where I just quietly corrected a mistake a colleague made, because this was a written document for animal welfare, and I just wanted to get that out and have it be right. Let's go to the next slide. What's the ultimate goal of education? Where's a student 10 years after high school? Well, they ought to be out doing something really good. I was designing some of my first big projects. We'll go to the next slide. And these next few slides, I'm going to talk about how did I sell myself. We need to short circuit the regular interview process. That needs to be short circuited because a lot of individuals that are different don't interview well. I learned to sell jobs by showing off my work. This is an example of one of my hand-done drawings. This is the hand-done drawing of the dipping vat project that was shown in the HBO movie. And when people saw my work, they took me seriously. We'll go to the next slide. And that's the drawing that I showed to the Cargill company. I designed the front end for all the Cargill beef plants in North America. And so I sent the head of Cargill drawings, pictures, a brochure. But sending that drawing to the HR department wouldn't have done any good. It's got to go somewhere where the people that see that drawing are going to appreciate it. Okay, Jenny, you worked on programming. You showed me programming. I wouldn't know good programming from bad programming. That's got to be shown to somebody that's going to appreciate it. we'll go on to the next slide. And then these are some of the pictures I sent. We'll go to the next slide. And that's a reproduction of my project from the 70s that was put in the movie. The movie showed very accurately how thinking in pictures works, and it showed very accurately my projects. Let's go to the next slide. That's my brochure. Basically what I did is to have a 30-second wow. Don't put much junk in the brochure. You want something they can look at quickly. If it's programming, I'd recommend no more than a page of text. Double space it so they can read it easily. Nicely titled what the programming is for. And we'll go on to the next slide. And we're going to end on that slide. And those are the pictures that I put in my original portfolio that I sent to the head of Cargill. And I think designing all those things that's pretty good for somebody they thought that was retarded and wasn't able to do anything. So now we got plenty of time for questions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that talk, Temple. That was really great. Really appreciate it. To start us off, you've written other books on related topics, such as Thinking in Pictures, My Life with Autism, The Autistic Brain, Thinking Across the Spectrum, among others. I'm really curious what inspired you to write this particular book.
What inspired me to write it was the trip I did in 2019, and I went to 4 places. 2 pork plants where all the equipment came from Holland, the poultry plant, 100 shipping containers from Holland, and the Steve Jobs Theater. And then I started researching things like the chip making machine. And I realized there was a big segment, and I named it the Clever Engineering Department, we were not making. And so both Betsy and I are locked up at home. COVID, I was grounded. All my speaking events were canceled. I was doing a bunch of calls on Zoom. And I called Betsy up and I said, let's do a book. But the impetus was this skill loss, which I'm very concerned about. We've got waterworks falling apart. We've got serious problems now with the power grid. Some of it, NASA has a special category called unclassified but sensitive. And I'm not going to discuss the details of some of the stuff where they're going to need a visual thinker like me to fix.
Yeah, thank you.
So that was the impetus for the book.
Yeah, it sounds like that was a powerful experience, seeing just that significant.
Well, the Steve Jobs Theater, there was a picture of me in the Steve Jobs Theater going like this, and I screamed, we don't make it anymore. And it reverberated with this weird reverberation. And then it had this crystal elevator that was broken, very difficult to maintain. I took one look at that, and I'm sure the elevator company is going, ugh, it's going to be horrible to maintain. And it did not work because I wanted to ride in it.
That sounds quite impactful and fairly visceral. So in your talk and in the book itself, there's a big call to really change the system. And you acknowledge in the book itself, there's a significant socioeconomic gap between who has access to what's needed to succeed, such as test prep, tutoring, just the exam cost, application costs to programs, buying books. There's a lot of...
Well, there's a lot of things. And a lot of the people I worked with came right out of a low-income environment, and a single high school welding class was the entry for about 3 people that built stuff for me. And then the other one, it grew up working on classic cars, was the other one. And they just started out. What would happen with these small shops, because I've been in this industry for 50 years, so I can remember when these shops small, they had a tiny little shop, they'd make something for one of the plants, and the plant liked them. Then the plant would gradually give them bigger and bigger projects. See, what's happening now is these shops aren't forming. And I talked to a guy who's in the car industry, and they said they farmed out all the work on the robots. And who is going to fix this stuff too? You see, there's 2 parts of engineering, and we're doing a great job on the mathematical side, but we've got a big skill loss on what I call the clever engineering department. And you go back and look at all the old patents, they'd all be the object visualizers, would have made something like a grain harvesting machine.
Sure, I imagine that's probably the case for a lot of those inventors. Given these barriers to entry, the financial investment, family support, just knowing that there are options, Do you have any vision on how we can reduce barriers to entry within at least the current educational
let's just talk
setup?
about maybe what Google could do. You see, there's a too much top-down thinking. All right, let's have like programathons where
Sure.
you get kids to come in, you teach them coding, and then you have them like building robots and stuff, and then you can see their skills. Where there's a place where they can show the skills. This is the kind of thing you see. Now, this is something specific. I'm not trying to solve the whole thing. And I had people that worked on my stuff that came out of a low-income background, and what saved them was single welding class. Now, I'm not saying everybody should be doing welding, but for my kind of mind, that's a big in. And there's a lot of back doors to jobs, and people don't see back doors. There's a scene in the HBO movie where I walk up to the editor of the magazine, get his card, and then I produced an article about my master's thesis. Seeing back doors, people that start out low-level jobs in big companies, and then they migrate over towards the things that they're good at. We have to short-circuit the regular front door interview process. And none of the people I worked with I would call were front door. Little shops turned into big shops.
Yeah. I'm laughing because I had a question prepared for you on specifically, what can employers, especially big employers like Google, and other companies with industry level experience take away from your book. But I did ask somebody who I think is more of a verbal linear thinker for some input on how to order my questions. And they suggested deferring it. So I'm just laughing because that's a very pressing and detail encapsulated question.
I think there's a real problem. And the ways to get, the people like me, we need to be able to show off our work and learn how to sell the work. And there's a lot of doors. Now, one of the places where in artificial intelligence you need training sets. There's been some very bad stuff with things they've done. They're so controversial, I don't even want to say it, but bad bias things that the training sets have done. And I've thought about it a lot, and that's something where I can help you. I can't do the programming, but I can help you with the training sets. See, this is where you need all the different kinds of minds. Okay, if you're programming a computer to play Go, well, there's no ethical issues there. It just learns how to play Go, which in the big scheme of things is it shows what computers can do. But let's get programs in the schools where I see kids raised by computer programmer parents, and they're so locked into the label, they don't think to teach their kid programming, even though they're programmers. I see stuff like that all the time. So I tend to think much more specific things we could do something targeted on a smaller scale. Another thing I did in all my cattle handling work, I wrote about it. And I wrote all kinds of articles. Here's how to design a corral. Here are the drawings. Here's the behavioral principles of cattle handling, point of balance, flight zone, just basic things. And I wrote about it. And sometimes there's some very innovative things that are done in some of the low-income communities. And stuff that's been very successful that needs to be written about. And people need information. How do I actually do this? But something I figured out very early on, that scene where I got the cards, really important, because most people don't see the back door.
Yeah, I mean, that relates even to my own lived experience, but I've seen this a lot with the people who I mentor, that there's just a big unknown. There's a lot of opportunity that might be out there, but figuring out what opportunities make sense, where to find them. You spoke to this a bit, but I was curious if you had any specific suggestions, particularly, for folks who are low income or are marginalized along racial, socioeconomic boundaries. Any advice on how to help those folks, the individuals, the families, or the communities themselves?
Well, let's just say, okay, we have the object visualizer, then we have the math mind. We're very different kinds of minds. So we'll discuss how to get them into skilled trades jobs for my minds, because that's appropriate for me. And how can we get them into programming jobs? Well, this is where putting shop classes back into the schools. And if we can't get it back into schools, maybe we make neighborhood workshops where these kids can learn stuff. You bring kids in and for your mathematical kids and have like math quad Olympics and things like that. Programming-a-thons where you can just start exposing kids, because there's no way you're going to learn programming if you're not exposed. I was exposed on the same computer, exact same computer, big teletype thing that Bill Gates had, and he could do it. I couldn't. He was a kid sneaking into the university computer lab. I took it as a course and had to drop it because I'm a little bit older, but I'm just seeing things like this we could do. And I think we need more bottom-up approaches to this. Is each place where Google is located, for example, how could you reach out? Of course, programming is the big thing, but you also need some of my kind of mind on content moderation, and that gets really, really controversial. But you see, I think about it visually in specific examples. Mm-hmm. And that's something where I could probably, my kind of mind could help you with that.
Mm-hmm. This isn't the platform to share about this specifically, but there are options at Google. There are a number of programs to help provide entryways for high school students. Yeah, to get involved, to experience, to be exposed.
Yes.
And it's a wonderful thing. I just imagine that type of thing being more widespread could, be really helpful to at least increase access.
Yeah, absolutely. And the tech industry, the computer industry has actually been better about reaching out but too many of the kids of my mind are playing video games in the basement. They're not becoming animators or doing anything like that. And there's been 5 or 6 cases now where young adults were weaned off of video games and car mechanics. And one of them is fixing trains now. You see, art and mechanical, they go together. I know that seems weird, but there's some things I've learned. I have spent so much time out on big, complicated construction projects. Now, I had my cattle handling stuff. Well, you better believe it. I walked around the whole entire plant they were building. And then I walked around it after it got finished. I walked around the whole entire plant looking at it because I find that stuff interesting. And the thing is, there's hardware stuff. I went in a server farm one time, and they were doing some ventilation stuff in there. And I go, I learned about this in hug house ventilation. Mm-hmm. They had just simultaneously invented some of the same principles of ventilation.
That's cool. It's great to be able to draw those connections.
Yeah.
I really enjoy those kinds of things. And so I think this is a really good pivot. So at least I went through a non-traditional or non-conventional education path. And at least at one point when I was in community college, the school I went to had a variety of trade school options. And at least from the little bit that I've seen, there are still trade school options available in the U.S. with lower financial burden and costs, especially going through
some states, very variable by state.
In some states. And to be fair, I was in California. Maybe this is a California thing. But the thing that I noticed was that, there seemed to be a bias. There was a huge bias, actually. My father is really, really skilled tradesperson and tried to get me into that field. Even having that background and seeing just the work ethic and how incredibly practical his skill set is.
Everything with me is practical. And you're working on this artificial machine learning. See, that's more mathematical. You see, the skilled trade stuff is more for my kind of thinker, but I worked with all kinds of people that barely graduated from high school, and they were inventing and patenting equipment, and some of them are selling it around the world. And I had to be somewhat vague about the equipment because they're not formally diagnosed, but I know one guy, stutterer, horrible student, dyslexic, very autistic acting, took one welding class, started making a thing. He sells them all over the world now.
Yeah. Well, I never thought I would make it to this. Well, I don't want to share too much about my own self because that's not
that's fine. But I've been accused of doing too much talking about myself, but my mind thinks in specific examples. Yes. I'm really sorry about interrupting, but this is where I have a problem with timing. My processor speed's really slow.
I have challenges with that as well. You were doing just fine. This is great. I really appreciate your inputs and your perspective. I'm curious if you have any, like the thing that I've seen is that even when there are programs available, when there are welding classes, there are trade skill schoolings, there seems to be a bias against doing those things. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts. It's a general question, but just on, a culture shift to value these things more. We're going to need people to, be able to build, repair electrical systems.
This is a values thing. You see, if you look up educational system in Italy, and I just did it again just the other day, Italy, Holland, where a lot of the equipment comes from. Italy even has an art route you can go into. And around 9th grade, you kind of go different routes. And Italy makes a lot of machinery. They make a lot of food processing stuff. Very, very beautiful machinery. And it goes back to what they value in their educational system. Mm-hmm. Okay, here, I was horrible in school. I failed the entrance exams. I got into college on a probation, and thank goodness I didn't have to take algebra. I had to drop engineering classes, and I went into a field where I didn't have to, do so much math. Okay, in China, they do a big exam that determines whether you get into college. You see, so that probably may have even more bias compared to here. But the thing is, visual thinking is a different kind of thinking. And when I was out on the book tour for my book, Visual Thinking, I did a talk at a school because the bookstore didn't have enough room. And I talked to a principal, this is in October, right, recently, who didn't know what my kind of thinking was. And he was asking me all these questions about it. And I think some people honestly truly think you have to have algebra for logical thinking. Well, that's not how I think. It's a different type of intelligence. And it shouldn't be looked at as a lesser form of intelligence. Because you want to keep the lights on, you're going to need us people who can't do algebra. Keep the waterworks running. You need all the different kinds of minds. And they need to understand they need to work together in a very complementary fashion.
Mm-hmm. I have just one last question for you before we go to audience questions.
Okay.
And this is more, I've read most of your memoir, and you recount some of this in visual thinking, but it sounds like you were really fortunate to have the mother who you had.
Yes, I did.
She had so much foresight.
Yes, she did.
And you also, came from a family that had, from what it sounds like, financial needs to be able to provide you extra tutoring, mentor, therapeutic support.
Where the financial support made the biggest difference was high school. Regular high school did not work for me because of all the bullying and teasing. Yeah. And that was expensive. Yeah. And then what they did at that high school is they put me to work for 3 years managing the school's horse barn, cleaning 9 stalls every day. I did 0 studying. Mm-hmm. And then my science teacher came on the scene. But I've also talked to people in good careers where, a single teacher. I've worked in construction with people where this was a boy that headed for nothing but trouble, and the shop teacher turned him around. Mm-hmm. You see that?
Yeah.
And you go in the developing countries, when I talk to them, I always use motorcycles as an example. Well, if somebody's good at fixing motorcycles, they can have a good career there. And there's tons of them in a lot of those countries because they can't afford cars. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, let's go to some audience questions.
Okay, wonderful. So our first question. Sometimes the characterization of autistics as gifted can be weaponized to ignore our struggles and deny support. How do you approach striking a healthy balance between gifts and struggles in conversation?
What the struggles are. Sensory. Okay, now we got a lot of LED lights, and some of these LED lights flicker. And I found out from a lighting contractor that one of the ways you can determine if an office has problems with that is to take pictures with your phone in slow motion. Play it back in slow motion. Now I do some waving, so you make sure you play it back in slow motion. You can find the bad LED lights. But this is something that for some individuals is very debilitating. It doesn't bother me. This is where things are different. being in a noisy environment. I'd rather get much more specific how we can, the lighting, I'd say in an office, lighting is big number one. And there's going to be certain LED lights that flicker, and it's going to be just intolerable. And then what you could do is get an LED light that does not flicker, a real strong one, and put it in the lamp next to your desk. Noise, well, there's noise canceling headsets. Some people need sensory breaks. I can't follow real high-speed chit-chat conversations. I simply can't follow them. So I had horrible problems with anxiety. Horrible. Until I went on antidepressant medication. And I've discussed that in Thinking in Pictures. My health was completely coming apart in my early 30s. Colitis that wouldn't stop. So I like to get more specific. Okay, let's deal with, there's certain things, lighting, noise, needing breaks. Okay, that's stuff at work. Bullies. And the other big thing I've run into is when the boss changes. That over and over again has been a problem area for a lot of people.
I'm guessing that this question might come from a place of like disclosure at work, for instance. If one were to tell somebody, oh, I'm autistic, there might be this notion of, oh, autism probably means that you're gifted. And I think there have been times where folks' struggles have been kind of ignored because there's this big gift presence, or because this person is really skilled at certain specific tasks.
Yeah, like certain programming stuff.
Sure.
And then, I think people can ignore that. And when I went into the cattle industry in the 70s, being a woman was a much bigger barrier. I got kicked out of stuff. I got bull testicles put on my vehicle. It was 10 times the barrier. It was really, really awful. And I had to make myself 3 times better than the guy. I couldn't believe this guy. I told you about the salesman that managed construction site. He still had a job after the factory had to close because they didn't have enough wastewater treatment. He still managed to have a job after that. Well, I would have been fired and would have been the end of me if I'd made a mistake that bad. Yeah. But I think on some of these things, it's going to help to get a little more specific on where the problem is.
Sure.
And there's the person can be super gifted in math, but not good at working with customers. I just talked to one of my friends who's in his 70s now. He designs mechanical devices for the food industry. And I said, who's going to replace you? He said, we got a super good guy, but man, he's awful working with customers. And telling them off and stuff. And this is stuff I had to learn not to do. My first job, I criticized some welding, and I said it looked like bird dew. And the plant engineer explained to me that was not acceptable, and I had to apologize. I did not say that I thought the welding was great. But there's some things just to be a little bit diplomatic. And there's oftentimes the person who's autistic isn't the one to run the business. And there was a sad case where a welding shop went broke. They expanded when the industry was having a feast and defaulted on a loan. I would have told them not to expand the shop, actually.
Yeah, I think to your point, it makes sense to have a diverse group of people working on things with different skill sets to make sure that you're covered in different areas. Even if one person is excellent at many things, they only have so much bandwidth. There are certainly going to be areas of,
what's another thing is when the boss changes. I had this happen to me. I was a livestock editor for our state farm magazine, and we got a new boss. He thought it was weird. And Susie, the nice lady who did the ad layouts, who I think was on the spectrum, said, this new boss doesn't like you. We better get a portfolio together of all your articles. And that saved my job. I didn't recognize the warning sign. The new boss didn't like me. And after he saw this big scrapbook, in fact, I still have it. It's about that thick, of all my articles, he gave me a raise. But I would have been fired if Susie hadn't recognized the warning signs. So that's a situation where I almost lost my first job with a change in boss.
Yeah. So there's another question. It's some of these questions, I think it's challenging to figure out the right degree of granularity versus breadth.
Yeah.
So There have been many changes in how autism is diagnosed over the last 20 years or so, arguably since autism's conception as a notion, especially given the rise of the neurodivergence movement. How have your views and feelings evolved around autism, since your diagnosis as a child?
Well, one of the things I made the mistake in some very early publications talking about curing autism. No, you just learn to adapt better. Those are old publications. I don't like the terms high and low functioning because some of the nonverbals can learn to type independently, and they actually have problems with disordered sensory, problems with controlling movement. And in all my autism talks, I talk about 3 authors, Tita Makapadehe, How Can I Talk If My Lips Don't Move, Carly's Voice, and then the Japanese boy, The Reason I Jump. His second book's actually more insightful. These are people that type independently. And unfortunately, my old publications, I use the high and low functioning. I don't use it in my new publications. So that's definitely evolved. Also, autism is a true continuous trait. When does slightly socially awkward become autism? And that's what the neuroscience is showing. It's truly continuous. It's not like having COVID, you've either got it or you don't, or tuberculosis.
Yeah, I mean, I would go so far as to say it's not even a continuum; it's a multi-dimensional.
Yeah, because you can have. I don't have the visual processing problem. I did have some auditory processing when I was little, and the grown-ups talked fast. It went to gibberish. My sensory problems are not quite as severe as some people. And there's been some new neuroscience research that's showing that the nerves having hyperexcitability is part of autism. But I think we have to be looking at what people can do. One of the big problems I'm seeing, parents overprotecting their kid. I'm seeing teenagers who have never gone shopping, never done laundry, haven't learned how to save money. I was taught that as a little kid. I knew exactly what 50 cents could buy. 5 comics. But if I wanted a 69-cent airplane, I had to save for 2 weeks. And that's a skill that they're not learning, that kind of stuff, simple stuff like that.
Yeah. So the next question we had actually was touching on the notions of high and low functioning or mild and severe labels. And it sounds like you spoke to that, and I really appreciate you acknowledging that. Yeah, that's a very important thing to a lot of folks in the communities that I work in as an autistic person myself.
I don't use those terms anymore. I'll call them fully verbal, nonverbal, or speaking or non-speaking.
Great.
I just didn't know any better. I mean, I've been around since the mid 80s. My very first book was Emergence that came out in 1986. And I did use the term autistic. And then the person with autism, and I started using that because people told me that's what I should use. Now I've gone pretty much back to using autistic. But my original title for that book in the mid 80s was Emergence Labeled Autistic.
Yeah, well, I'm personally very glad to witness this transition and transformation. I think it's a really good thing for the community, given you're so visible, you have so much influence, and your words have a lot of impact, and we really appreciate that.
Well, and I'd like to talk to you further after the Farak, and give you my contact information, because when I worked in construction, I worked with a lot of people that were on the spectrum. And I remember an IT person that worked at one of the plants. I mean, he was just as autistic as he could be. And some of the best times we ever had was sitting around talking about how to build stuff. You see, that's friends who shared interests.
Yeah.
And that's something that's just so important. I remember a lady that she got a job with a tech doing programming, and she says, "I'm with my people now. I love my job." And I want to see more people doing that.
Yeah, that's a topic that comes up very often in my community and among autistic folk at Google. Okay, so this is about neurodivergent thinking in mammals like felines, canids, equines. Do you know if there are patterns of, for example, neurodivergent thinking in these animals? And is there anything that we can learn from them in terms of how we can adapt or how we can process things?
The last chapter of visual thinking book is about animal consciousness. And I can't believe people are still arguing about this. And I think some of it is verbal thinking versus sensory-based thinking. If you think completely in words, you think, well, how the dog can think without words. But since I don't think in words, it makes total sense. The dog lives in a sensory-based world. And yeah, he does think. Now, he's not going to invent a rocket ship to go to the moon, but they definitely have thinking. And when I did one of my books, Animals in Translation, I discussed how being a visual thinker and autistic helped me with animals. Because to understand animals, you must get away from verbal language. I tell that to every veterinary student, animal science student that I talk to. Understand an animal, get away from words. Then you'll start to understand an animal. And maybe we'll have to end there because I'm getting chat notes here to wrap it up.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. Thank you for this great conversation. Really appreciate your time. It's been great to have you here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been absolutely wonderful. We've talked about a lot of good things, and it'd be great to be here. I'm going to sign off now.
Thank you. Thank you, Temple.
Okay.